So now that we're familiar a little bit with Boxcutter, we can actually go back and talk about the various types of modes. So the whole time that we've been working, we've been in cut mode, which means that if I click and drag, I begin drawing a red box, which will attempt to cut into the shape that we have selected. Of course, always have the shape selected that you intend to cut, or else you will do what's called a make box, which is a box that is drawn whenever nothing is selected and is an entirely different type of system unto itself. However, there's more to Boxcutter than just cutting. However, cutting is the origin of why Boxcutter was born, and the main thing that you'll be using Boxcutter to do is actually performing cuts. But there's a lot more to it than just that. If we go from cut, we can go over to slice, which can be activated with X. In fact, if you want to switch, you can always just press X to cycle through some of your available cutters. We'll press X and switch back over to slice. And to make the shape color a little bit less overbearing, we'll press H to hide it. And now we can actually look at our shape here and just think about it. So we're just pressing B to bevel, rolling the wheel down to bevel it slightly, and we'll just click, and now this is its own separate object. So we can actually change this back over to cut and begin making adjustments to this new section of mesh that's been cut off and separated. And we could even go back to slice and perform another slice and separate this piece off and begin making cuts to this as well. So that is slice in a nutshell. The next one I want to talk about is intersect. Intersect is interesting because it uses an intersect boolean mod, which means it will only keep what is inside the cutter region. And this can be interesting for things just like I'm showing you here, where maybe you want to simplify everything down to a cylindrical silhouette in order to progress forward with it. This is the tool for that. The next one I want to go over is inset. So inset is an interesting one because it sometimes will work and sometimes will not because of the way that it works, and that is it duplicates the mesh, performs a solidification, and lets that cut back into the mesh, which gives us the illusion of what we call an inset. And the interesting thing about this is that we can still make adjustments to it. We can rotate it, we can shift drag this dot in order to move it around and make adjustments. We could press Ctrl D and set our rotation snap angle to something a little less intense, so we can actually play with this a little bit more finely. But whenever inset is working, it actually works very nice, and you can even press T in order to adjust the thickness. But notice that there are limits to the amount of thickness that you can give it, and the more complex the mesh that you give it, the more complex a result that it's giving back to it, and the more interesting a result that you're going to be getting in return. So that's probably the easiest and nicest way I can put that, but just something to keep in mind when it comes to using inset. Also, if you want to toggle to inset just from cut, you can just press X, X, X in order to toggle over to it. And here I am adjusting the thickness in order to get the piece inside to show back up because the complexity was probably just becoming a little much for it. And we can just click and apply. And that is inset in a nutshell. Join is the next one that I want to talk about. So whenever it comes to drawing a shape and actually having it unify with the original shape, that is where join comes in. I just drew a shape, press Shift T in order to taper, and now this shape is now part of the initial shape. Sometimes I will press J in order to jump over to join, but normally I never start with join as an actual start state. Seeing a green box on screen is quite interesting to see, something I normally never see. So the next one we'll be going to is knife. And so for knife, in order to show this one action, we're just going to make a clean scene and just start over in Boxcutter. I'll press D and use the pie menu to switch over to circle, and we're just going to cut some circles in this mesh. And if you saw the fundamentals that was leading up to this, you definitely know what to expect here. But as we perform these cuts, Blender's just having to calculate how to make these booleans work out. And circles are inherently some of the most expensive shapes in order to cut, so you can notice it's slowing down a little bit. And that's because my circle segment is still at 128, which is just out of control. But the thing I want to show is that if we press Alt V using HardOps and we look at the wireframe, we see that the wireframe solved for things rather nastily. So let's just press on our shape symbol and change things over to box, and notice that for operations or modes we actually have a quick toggle for knife, and that's because knife is rather essential for having an ability to just cut in surfaces and allow you to do corrections on booleans. So by connecting these cuts with an edge manually, I'm able to get them to get a much better solve than they would have received manually, which can sometimes help bring a little sanity to your mesh whenever you're, say, working with the bevel modifier. Of course, during this mode, we're still able to move things around and make adjustments. We'll just draw and press spacebar in order to make it even faster. And just notice that as we're cutting through these, that we're allowing a better solve to come through instead of what Blender was giving us. So something like this will actually play a lot nicer with the bevel modifier compared to having them actually skew everywhere and result in geometric artifacting. So knife can be useful in a couple of interesting cases, but this is one of my favorites. In fact, another way you can use knife is just, say, subdividing a plane and removing only faces, leaving just a mesh. And if we press D and switch over to custom, the interesting thing about custom is that all the cuts you saw me do were done using the mesh intersect system, which is what takes over whenever you're cutting in 3D. But if you cut in 2D, you actually use something called knife project. So if you start off the mesh or you're working in view align, you can actually use a custom cutter that's actually the shape of something that has no faces, and you'll cut it in just like you see me doing here. So in the event that I wanted to dice a shape using Boxcutter or just cut grids into something, I'm able to quickly do that using the differences between view align and surface align knife. So knife has a bit of a backstory and multiple things going on with it under the hood, but we definitely tried our best to make it as flexible as possible for allowing you to get the most out of Boxcutter. The next thing I want to talk about is extraction. So to show extraction, we have to create something actually worth extracting. And instead of toggling to it through the modes up top, we will just bring it up via its hotkey of Y. But first, let's just perform some cuts here. And we're just drawing a circle, pressing J to turn it into a join. And that is actually good enough. So we'll press D and change this to box. And first, what I like to do is draw a box around it, cutting out what I'm going to extract so I see what I'm taking away. And then when I press Y, it'll switch over to a type of slice box that we call extract. And whenever you click, that piece has been taken out and your cutter has been made. The custom cutter with the shape that's extracted made the custom cutter. And that means that the next thing I draw is going to be the same exact shape that I extracted. So I'm holding shift to keep things proportional and even. And I'm shift dragging this dot in order to move the shape around freely. And we could just drag this dot down while holding shift in order to just snap this into place. And this is us literally repeating this entire area in another area. And the interesting thing about custom is that if we were to turn on line custom, we can now draw a line, allowing us to draw this custom cutter in any direction that we want. Left click, right click in order to pause, or just press tab. And we can just move this shape around. Let's say that we wanted to actually draw this at an angle. No problem. And shift drag in order to get it proportionally accurate to the area that we originally took it from. And just like that, we can just begin imprinting this pattern just everywhere to our heart's desire. And that, in a nutshell, is custom cutter and using it with extraction. But extraction is just one of those tools that once you use it, it's going to throw you immediately into custom cutter. So you just want to keep that in mind when you press the hotkey of Y in order to perform an extraction. The next one I want to talk about is make. Make is generally summoned whenever you have nothing selected. Like if I deselected this box and just drew, I would just draw a make box. However, not a custom. We want to switch this back over to box, and we could just draw out any shape we want without it being attached to anything via a boolean. And because we're in the make mode, that means that we can select this shape and just begin drawing make boxes using areas to jump off of, holding shift, and really get some interesting results. However, kind of looking at things from a very strange angle, you know, of course using our hotkeys for mirror to get the most out of it, pressing E to extrude and dragging our dots, and just like that we are just very quickly getting something interesting with our block and playing with make. So I use make all the time whenever I'm just kind of messing with ideas. Sometimes I will just create a bunch of blocks and then just experiment with detailing them one by one sequentially, just going through them until it becomes something looking worthy of showcasing to people. But just letting you know that make exists as a state. We will just use B for box select and just select everything and remove it. And I'm going to jump over to Ngon and lasso, and we see that you can use make even in lasso mode to just draw out a shape, make it, and just instantly have a shape you can just switch back over to cut and begin going to town on. So this is just a little bit about how you can get started with all the various modes of operation in Boxcutter. I probably should have went over it first, but I figured that cut was a pretty good initiation to get us in the door with most concepts, and it would be easier for us to double back and talk about these, since cut is definitely the main focus of Boxcutter.